Who's the aircraft 3 miles east of LAX? Police 16, are you on a call?
16, affirm.
Alright, we just had a TCA violator possible near midair. Just let me know.
Roger, we're answer.
He's 3 mile final, 2-4. I don't know, I think he's circling. Hey, he's coming back.
Alaska 229, traffic alert, traffic 12 o'clock, 3 miles southbound. Altitude indicates 1,300, type unknown. It does have a transponder there. Nobody is talking to that aircraft, including approach control. Do you have that traffic in sight?
Yeah, we got him in sight 12 o'clock and, going southbound.
Okay, Alaska 229, thank you.
Police 16.
Yeah, what was the current location of that aircraft, sir?
He's over Hawthorne Airport right now, 2,100 southbound. Don't know if he's going to continue towards Torrance. He's on downwind to Hawthorne now at 2,000 feet. He's lost. Police 16.
Yeah, verify you want us to ramp check that gentleman, that individual at Papa.
Affirmative. He looks like he's trying to land there. He's on a 1 mile final for Hawthorne.
Copy. We got a sheriffs are going to be doing that for us. And, we'll switch over.
Affirmative, yeah, we'll need all this information if they're able to get on the airport and get it from them.
As you just heard, this past weekend a small aircraft blundered into the approach corridor at LAX, and it was just 3 miles off the end of the runway at 1,100 feet, which is almost exactly the altitude that an airliner would be at that distance. LA's finest did catch up with the pilot after he landed at Hawthorne, and I'm thinking that guy, well, he's probably going to need a lawyer. Our thanks to liveatc.net for the audio. Hello again, and welcome back to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe when you fly. I'm Max Trescott. Now, I have a really large backlog of listener questions you've sent in. Today, we're going to answer many of the questions sent in about IFR and instrument flying. In a future show, we'll tackle more of your questions about other subjects. By the way, if you have thought about maybe someday buying a Cirrus SR20, SR22, or SF50 Vision Jet, or you would like flight training in any one of these, there's just a whole lot I can do to help you. So please give me a call today at 650-967-2500 for a free consultation and possibly a free demo flight. Now, last week in episode 117, we talked with aviation attorney Scott Williams about the top 10 legal mistakes made by pilots and aircraft owners. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. This week in the news, the FAA is investigating a medical helicopter pilot who fell asleep at the controls. Thieves broke into 9 airplanes to steal avionics, and we'll tell you where they struck. And a young teenager who went joyriding in a seaplane might get pilot training. All this and more, and the news starts now. From WCVB.com, that's going to be a television website in Boston, FAA is investigating allegations that the pilot of an emergency medical aircraft fell asleep at the controls with a patient on board. According to a statement from the FAA, the pilot was flying a Boston MedFlight helicopter from Martha's Vineyard to a Boston area hospital on June 24th when the alleged incident occurred. Boston MedFlight indicated that the pilot overflew a designated helipad. The company said the trip was eventually completed successfully and no one was injured. Boston MedFlight Chief Executive Maura Hughes said in a statement that the company found fatigue was a factor and is working with a fatigue management consultant and safety consultant to review company policies and procedure. The pilot no longer works for Boston MedFlight. The company says it flies more than 1,800 critical care transport missions annually. From aeronews.net, thieves break into at least 9 airplanes in New Hampshire. At least 9 airplanes at the Nashua, New Hampshire airport, that's KASH, were damaged by thieves who took tens of thousands of dollars of electronic equipment over the weekend. The thefts were discovered early Saturday. Television station WMUR reported that there are about 200 planes based at the airport. Airport manager Chris Lynch said that everyone feels extremely violated. Officials said the thieves took GPS and communication equipment from the airplanes. Farrell Woods, chairman of the Nashua Airport Authority Board, said that the losses from each individual aircraft ranged from several hundred to several $1,000s. He said that the thieves knew what they were looking for because the airplane's transponders, which were individually serialized to a particular aircraft and owner, were left behind. The thieves used a pry bar to break the locks on the airplanes, and the doors were damaged. One airplane to which they did not gain access suffered a broken window and door handle. Lynch said that tampering with aircraft is a federal offense. Quote, "It's a very serious crime." Now, I must say that these kinds of thefts seem to come in waves. I mentioned some avionics thefts earlier this year in a prior podcast, and those were the first that I'd heard of in many years. Now, I remember quite a few years ago, probably 15, 20 years ago, there was a scam in which thieves would swap avionics from one plane to another, so it wasn't obvious to you that your avionics had been stolen unless you pulled them out and looked at the serial number. So watch out. From aeronews.net, Southwest Airlines launches new Pilot Pathways program. Southwest has launched an innovative career program called Destination 225 Degrees, which provides pathways to becoming a competitively qualified candidate for future Southwest first officer positions. Now, on a compass, 225 degrees is, yep, you guessed it, the direction for Southwest. Destination 225 Degrees was developed to lead aspiring pilots to Southwest Airlines. By the way, when I first read this story, I thought that it was a direct path to a major carrier, which would have been unusual, as typically most pilots would need to start at a regional carrier before going to a major like Southwest. But there are actually some interim steps that are required before you can go from flight training to Southwest, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. To offer the program, Southwest plans to join with well-known industry partners that will provide participants with training and flight experience to reinforce the, quote, Southwest way of flying as candidates complete their journey to becoming a professional pilot. Planned Destination 225-degree partners include CAE, Bell Murray Aviation, US Aviation, JetLinks, Exojet Aviation, iAero Group Swift Air, Arizona State University, Southeastern Oklahoma State University, University of Nebraska Omaha, and the University of Oklahoma. Participants who apply, interview, and are selected for the Destination 225-degree program will receive a Southwest mentor during their years of training, be invited to Southwest for training activities and events, and ultimately have the opportunity to apply for selection as a Southwest first officer. There is no cost to apply to the program. However, candidates advancing through a training program and the selection process will be responsible for all the costs incurred. So in other words, this program is not free. You will pay all the expenses. Now, here are a couple of the different versions of the program they have. They have the cadet pathway, which they say is for ab initio, or in other words, from the beginning program that provides passionate, skilled individuals with a multi-year training program. And this is going to be in partnership with CAE, which, of course, most people know is a large simulator manufacturer. Classroom and flight training will take place at CAE's Phoenix Training Facility. The goal of the program is to have candidates qualified and prepared to apply for positions with planned program partners such as Exojet Aviation or JetLinks to gain the flying experience necessary to be a competitive first officer candidate at Southwest. So there's the missing link there that I wasn't aware of. After you go through all your training, you'll go to either Exojet or JetLinks, get some experience, and then go on to interview at Southwest. Another program they have is the University Pathway Program. That's designed for collegiate aviators, so folks who are in an aviation program at one of 4 different colleges. And coincidentally, earlier today, a CFI introduced me to someone who is leaving this week for Arizona State University to be a part of this particular program. They also have the Military Pathways Program, which bridges the gap for active military pilots who do not yet meet the minimums to start their career as an airline pilot. If an individual has previous rotor powerlift experience as a military pilot, this pathway will develop the skills and experience necessary for fixed-wing airline operations. And Southwest is known for incredible employees, and in a planned partnership with CAE and US Aviation Academy, Southwest employees will be able to apply for the employee pathway to pursue a career as a professional pilot. So think about that. If you're a flight attendant or have some other position at Southwest, this could put you on the track to becoming a pilot. From generalaviationnews.com, a senator is seeking input from GA pilots. U.S. Senator Jim Inhofe, Republican of Oklahoma, a GA pilot with more than 1,100 hours, is seeking input from GA pilots on draft legislation to establish a national center for the advancement of aviation. He says, quote, my legislation would form an independent, non-government center tasked with 4 key goals to support the future of American aviation. And those goals include foster a diverse and reinvigorated aviation workforce, facilitate new and expanded STEM educational opportunities for high school students interested in aviation, serve as a central repository of safety and economics data, and support research and collaborate on training methods and new technologies. You can find a text of the draft on Inhofe's Senate website, and we'll also include a link in our show notes to a section summary of the bill. From LasVegasSun.com, a pilot accused of being drunk when he crash-landed a jet in Mesquite, Nevada, told officers he didn't drink and fly, but rather, get this, he chugged vodka after surviving the fiery wreck, according to a Mesquite police arrest report. And yeah, I'm guessing that when this guy was a kid, the dog ate his homework as well. Pretty unlikely story, but who knows. Anyway, the pilot, 41 years old, of Spokane, Washington, was the sole occupant of the twin-engine Cessna 550 jet, was arrested on a gross misdemeanor count of flying while under the influence. After the crash, he smelled of alcohol, his eyes were glassy, his speech was slurred, and he could not stand straight, police said. He was also uncooperative, according to the report. Quote, when I asked him specific questions about the crash, he continued to respond with answers which were irrelevant to the questions, an investigator wrote in the report. He refused to submit to any field sobriety test and was taken to a hospital, where he said it would take 30 officers to hold him down for a blood draw. He said, I'll blow, but there's no way you're sticking a needle in my arm, he said, according to the report. Investigators eventually obtained a warrant to draw blood. He took off from Pasco, Washington on a planned flight to Henderson Executive Airport, FAA spokesman Ian Greger said. For reasons unknown, he landed in Mesquite. FAA records show that he's a certified ATP pilot since 2015, but that he wasn't supposed to be flying that type of aircraft without a certified co-pilot. And I got to tell you, I see these kinds of things all the time. When someone is accused of one misdeed, well, it's often the case that they've done other misdeeds as well. So pilots, please try to follow every rule, because the rules are there to protect you. And, if you start trying to think about which rules you're, willing to break, well, that's a pretty slippery slope. From FlyingMag.com, the FAA says that ICAO flight plan format becomes mandatory next month. Now, ICAO, by the way, is ICAO, and it's a change that's been long in the coming, and thanks to the proliferation of flight planning apps, it won't have much of a practical impact. But the FAA confirms that starting at the end of next month, pilots must file IFR flight plans using the international ICAO format. The new format appears on FAA Form 7233-4, FAA International Flight Plan. Aligning flight plans with the rest of the world will smooth the transition to new capabilities such as performance-based navigation, which is part of Next Gen. The FAA announced the plan to adopt the ICAO flight plan format in late 2016. Since that time, many pilots have adopted tablet computers running flight planning apps to file their flight plans. The apps will automatically update to the new format by the time the change officially takes effect on August 27th if they haven't already. Pilots who file VFR and IFR flight plans the old-fashioned way must be sure to use the ICAO form or risk having their request denied or delayed. Detailed guidance on how to complete an international flight form is available at a link that we will include in the show notes. From GeneralAviationNews.com, unleaded avgas now available for sale at KSQL. Swift Fuel's unleaded avgas UL94 will become available September 15th at San Carlos Airport. That's KSQL here in Northern California. It's the first airport in California to sell the unleaded aviation gasoline, according to Swift officials. To accommodate the new fuel, Rabbit Aviation Services has completed a planned upgrade to its aviation fuel tank facility. Quote, nobody likes lead, neither your engine nor the environment, said Dan DeMeo, CEO of Rabbit Aviation Services. General Aviation needs a piston fuel for the future, and that future doesn't include toxic lead, so why not begin the transition with the highest quality unleaded fuel? Working with our airport management and our elected county supervisors, we drafted the first agreement to supply a lead-free avgas alternative in the state. Swift Fuel's UL94 is the only commercially available unleaded avgas in the United States. It's sold nationwide. It's commercially insured for aviation, and pilots who use it love it, said Chris DaCosta, CEO for Swift Fuels. More than 110,000 aircraft are already FAA authorized to use UL94 as a drop-in ready fuel, DaCosta added. He said that UL94 is not a full replacement for 100 low lead, so only those aircraft with engine airframes requiring 94 motor octane fuels or lower are compatible, which represents about 65% of the U.S. piston fleet. Now, here's a story that was sent by listener Kent in Tennessee. Oxford family sues FAA over fatal airplane crash, claims controllers gave pilots false information. This comes from MagnoliaStateLive.com. The family of a Mississippi couple killed in a 2016 plane crash in Alabama have filed a federal lawsuit alleging federal air traffic controllers gave late and false information to the pilot, which led to the accident They killed all 6 people on board. The 6 were killed August 14th, 2016, when their small plane lost power over Alabama, as the 3 couples were en route to Oxford, Mississippi, after a dental convention in Florida. Husband and wife dentist Jason and Leah Faris, along with dentist Michael Perry and his wife Kimberly Perry, and dentist Austin Poole and his wife Angie Poole, were all killed when the Faris' plane crashed short of the Tuscaloosa, Alabama airport, reported the Tuscaloosa News newspaper. The Perry's estate filed the lawsuit alleging that pilot Jason Faris was given delayed and incorrect information by ATC when the airplane had problems. Federal investigators officially listed the cause of the crash as pilot error and said pilot Jason Faris lacked proper training. The lawsuit, however, alleges that when pilot Faris alerted them that he was in trouble and sought to be diverted to the nearest airport, air traffic controllers incorrectly told Faris he was 9 miles closer to the Tuscaloosa airport than he was. Ultimately, the airplane crashed into the ground approximately 550 yards short of the Tuscaloosa runway. The lawsuit said the 9-mile error was catastrophic. Further, the lawsuit claims that air traffic controllers did not treat the incident as an emergency soon enough, immediately instructing Faris to maintain his altitude, which may have ultimately curtailed his ability to glide the powerless plane to a runway, the lawsuit alleges. The lawsuit seeks $24 million that would go to the couple's 3 children. And let me read just a portion of the lawsuit here. It says, furthermore, at 16:04, the controller, it gives the controller's name, instructed the pilot to descend and maintain 4,000 and advise if you need any assistance. Also at 16:06, the controller instructed the pilot to descend and maintain 2,300 before issuing these mandatory altitude instructions to an aircraft losing power and trying to make an airport. The controller failed to determine what effect they would have on the pilot's ability to reach the Tuscaloosa airport. Had the pilot maintained best glide airspeed instead of trying to comply with mandatory altitude instructions, the aircraft would have likely made the runway instead of crashing 1,600 feet short. In one of the most egregious errors at 16:08, after the pilot advised of manifold pressure loss, controller told the pilot, I do have an airport over at your 3 o'clock, about 8 miles. Tuscaloosa is dead ahead, 20 miles. In reality, the Tuscaloosa airport was 29 miles away, a distance error of over 45%. Had ATC relayed the proper distance information, the pilot may well have elected to divert to a closer airport considering his building loss of power. Instead, the aircraft crashed 1,600 feet short. Now, just to get the other side of the story, I went out and found the NTSB report. The probable cause says NTSB determined the probable cause of this accident to be a total loss of power in both engines due to fuel starvation as a result of the pilot's fuel mismanagement and a subsequent failure to follow the emergency checklist. Contributing to the pilot's failure to follow the emergency checklist was his lack of emergency procedures training in the accident airplane. In international news from flyer.co.uk, that's Flyer magazine, the Silver Spitfire expedition has taken off from the Goodwood Aerodrome for its around-the-world flight. So that would be, it's departed England. The flight is intended to take 4 months and can be followed on a live tracker, and we'll include a link to that live tracker in the show notes. 2 pilots will take turns flying the aircraft, Matt Jones and Steve Brooks of the Bothby Academy. The 1943 MKIX Spitfire is finished in polished aluminum and has the guns and camouflage paint removed to demilitarize the aircraft, both to broaden the expedition's appeal and reach and to gain easier access to nations en route. A Pilatus PC-12 single-engine turboprop is the support aircraft carrying one of the Spitfire pilots, a chief engineer, expedition director, and TV crews. And when I looked at this a few days ago, the aircraft had reached Iceland and they were traveling from east to west, which is kind of interesting. I think most expeditions go in the opposite direction, so they should be here in the United States pretty soon. Also in international news from yahoo.com, a boy who stole 2 airplanes for a joyride could receive pilot training. A Chinese boy who stole 2 seaplanes and took them for a joyride could receive pilot training. The 13-year-old drove the aircraft around a car park before hitting a crash barrier with one, causing 8,000 won, that's, by the way, about $1,100 worth of damage, reports the South China Morning Post. He was caught on closed-circuit television arriving by electric bike at the Taihu Lake Hangar in eastern Sichuan province around midnight on July 15th. The teenager from Huzhu City had spent a large part of the weekend observing staff doing maintenance work on the planes at the Sea Ray base in preparation for the stunt. He was seen pulling a 450-kilogram seaplane from its hangar, climbing into the cockpit, and starting the engine. He proceeded to drive it around the airport, hitting the barrier before switching to another plane and taking it for a further 3 circuits of the car park. The prankster's parents only realized what their son had been up to when staff contacted them to negotiate a settlement for the damage caused. However, he was praised for his observation skills, with a Sea Ray base director saying, "We pilots all admired him." The director added that he would like to train the team to become a pilot at the base. Well, that's pretty unusual. You don't usually hear of a 13-year-old being praised for stealing an airplane. And finally, here's a heartwarming story. This comes from aeronews.net. Jessica Cox to take delivery of her first airplane. Armless pilot to be the proud owner of a 1946 Air Coupe. On Mother's Day 2008, Jessica Cox flew an airplane by herself for the first time in her life. Becoming a pilot is a challenge of training, knowledge, and skill, which was complicated by the fact that Jessica was born without arms. 5 months after her first solo flight, Jessica passed exams by the FAA and earned her light sport pilot certificate. On August 10th, Jessica received the keys to a vintage airplane she has sought for over a decade. The Air Coupe airplane was built in the 1940s without rudder pedals to be a safe and straightforward airplane to fly. The simplicities of the controls are what allowed Jessica to fly. Quote, "I put 1 foot on the yoke and 1 foot on the throttle." Until now, Jessica logged all of the roughly 200 hours she has flown on airplanes she rented from other pilots, instructors, or aviation clubs. Earlier this year, Jessica joined an Air Coupe club at Ryan Airfield. Shortly after that, Jessica and the club members were devastated to learn that the airplane they were using had developed a structural issue. The issue meant the aircraft could no longer fly. The repair would cost several $1,000s, according to the club mechanic, which represented a significant fraction of the airplane's total value. Jessica and her fellow club members scoured the internet for a replacement plane. Because of its age, few air coupes remain airworthy, so they are often hard to find. Eventually, Jessica found a working, ready-to-fly air coupe for sale in Tahoe, Nevada, and spoke to the owner about acquiring the plane. The man selling the aircraft listed it at $23,000, which represented a challenging sum to fundraise for a club with less than a dozen members. However, the air coupe seller knew of Jessica's story and her work with children with disabilities, and he decided instead to donate the plane to Jessica. "I was beyond stunned," said Jessica. "I've dreamed of owning an airplane since I started. I can't wait to sit in it and fly in it for the first time." After proper inspections, a volunteer pilot will ferry the air coupe from Nevada to Tucson, Arizona. In 2005, Jessica began speaking professionally as a motivational speaker. Since then, she has personally visited more than 20 countries and advocates for international disability rights as the Goodwill Ambassador for the NGO Humanity and Inclusion. Jessica earned her light sport ticket in 2008, which earned her the Guinness World Record for becoming the first person without arms to do so. She's also a U of A graduate, a certified scuba diver, licensed driver, surfer, the first armless black belt in ATA martial arts, and an award-winning speaker. And our congratulations to her. I hope she has a great time flying her new airplane. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up, my weekly updates. And then we'll get on to our main topic, which is answering your many questions about instrument flying and IFR. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Hey, if you haven't done so already, please go ahead and click the subscribe button on whatever podcast player you're listening to, because that helps us with our rankings in the Apple Podcast app. The more people subscribe, the more they promote the show and move it up in the rankings. Now, that doesn't cost you anything, and you'll get the show downloaded for free every week to your smartphone. So just click on subscribe. And in the last few weeks, I've been interviewed for a couple different podcasts. One's been released already. That's Plane Talking UK. So that's done out of England. Episode 279 with Carlos and Matt. Now, they do that on YouTube, and I'll include a link to that so you can watch their show. And here's a brief portion from that show.
Actually, we've got a question for you, Max, from the chat room, from Tony S. He says that if you would have been working for the Cirrus design team, is there anything you would have done differently with the design of the aircraft?
Tough question. I really admire good design. That's just one of the things that I'm really drawn to. And I've been particularly drawn to the Cirrus jet because I think the design is really excellent. I mean, there's so many first impressions you get when you jump into the aircraft, which hold through. You know, for example, it looks roomy. It looks like the cockpit is very streamlined and simplified. and it's easy to get into. Let me just give you some points of comparison. By the way, I think the simple answer to the question is no. I can't think of anything I would do differently. But let me tell you about some of the things that I think really distinguish it. For example, I have taught in a citation from time to time. And for me to climb into a Cessna citation, I'm a little over 6 feet tall. And to get into the right front seat, it takes probably 45 to 50 seconds just to kind of pretzel my body into that space. I mean, if you ever had to get out in a hurry, forget it. It's not going to happen. Climbing into the Cirrus Vision Jet, if you're going to sit in one of the front seats, it's like sitting in my office chair here. I mean, that's how easy it is to get into. Most seats slide back probably a full 3+ feet. So there's just tons of room to get in. You slide them forward. So that's incredibly simple. And then most jets, when you're in the cockpit and you look around you, you see switches over every square inch of space. And I get that. I mean, as engineers, we're trained for efficiency. And I think one definition of efficiency is, oh, there's a blank spot there. We can put a switch right there. So you just end up with stuff everywhere. They took really the opposite approach with the Vision Jet. They looked at how to eliminate everything and to just put it into touchscreen controllers. So basically, a lot of the functions that had switches are now interact with a touchscreen controller to turn functions on and off. And so the result is you have an incredibly clean design from a cockpit standpoint. It almost looks like you're getting into a luxury car. You've got the glass panels right in front of you. You've got a huge windshield, above it. You've got a couple little, controls down below it, but then you've got nothing off to the sides. There's nothing above and to the right, above and to the left, along the sides. So it's just a really, really clean design. And I want to thank Carlos and Matt for having me on the show. Fun to join them there in the UK. And speaking of the Vision Jet, boy, I got to fly it twice here in the last week, which is great because I hadn't been in it for about 3+ months. So that was quite enjoyable. One of those trips was to the Dells. That's Dalles, which is up on the Columbia River on the border of Oregon and Washington State. And holy cow, was it windy there. Winds were gusting probably about 34, 35 knots. And I learned when I was up there that constant wind down the gorge actually makes it one of the best kite surfing and windsurfing areas in the country. So that was kind of fun to see all of those people on the river. So great fun flying the Vision Jet. And by the way, I posted photos on my Facebook page. So if you haven't followed me on Facebook, go into the show notes, which you'll find at aviationnewstalk.com, or by sliding up the artwork on whatever podcast player you're listening to now, and in the notes you'll find a link to my Facebook page. And speaking of Facebook, one of the more popular items that I posted recently was a video of an Icon A5 crash that occurred in late July in Michigan. And I've read elsewhere that the pilot may have worked for the company and possibly was giving a demonstration to a prospective buyer. The thing that was really most intriguing about the crash is apparently they tried 3 different times to get off the water. Relatively small lake, I think somewhere on the order of 2,800 feet across. But from the video, it doesn't look like they used the full length of the lake, so it's unclear why they started their takeoff run where they did. And they took off, and as they reached the tree line, it looked like the aircraft may have stalled, and then as it stalled, it hit a tree and then went into the water. I've read that both people survived, so that's good. Speaking of the Icon A5, I did run across a story in the dailyherald.com about another Icon A5 crash that was only a couple weeks before that occurred in the Chicago area, Chicago Executive Airport. Interesting story about how that aircraft pilot was found. After the crash, he called the 911 number on his cell phone. They used cell towers to ping his phone, find his location. Then they sent a screenshot of his GPS location to the searchers so that they could find him. And that was at nighttime, so good that they were able to find him relatively quickly. And I'll include links to both the crash video as well as to the story about the rescue of the pilot near Wheeling, Illinois. And I did want to just say parenthetically that there have been 5 different incidents that have occurred this year with the Icon A5. Doesn't look like any of them really were the fault of the aircraft. It looks like pilot training is probably the issue in all these cases, as it is with the vast majority of accidents with any aircraft. So hope that Icon continues to do well. They did just recently announce a 40% layoff of their staff. Article I read on that said that they were unable to get the additional investment they needed from China due to the ongoing trade war. Also, I know that the price of the aircraft has increased quite a bit since they first released it, so that might be a factor as well, though that wasn't mentioned in the article. Anyway, links to all these in the show notes. And I want to let you know where I will be appearing. I'm going to be at the AOPA Regional Fly-In just about a month from now, September 13th and 14th in Tullahoma, Tennessee. I'll be flying into Nashville and then driving over. First time I've been there. I'll be giving a presentation at noon on Friday on night flying safety, what your CFI didn't teach you. And on Saturday morning, I've got my advanced IFR class for advanced modern glass cockpit GPSs. And we're going to have a meetup. So on Friday at 5 p.m., join me at the Starbucks, which is just a minute or two away from the Tullahoma Regional Airport. That's September 13th and 14th. Hope to see you there. Now, here's an item that may be of interest to pilots who have spouses or companions, partners that fly with them who are non-pilots, and you'd like those people to learn more about how to assist you in the cockpit and how to feel more comfortable flying. The Santa Clara Valley 99s is once again holding their Flying Companion Seminar, which they hold every summer. They say the workshop is for pilots' friends, family, and frequent passengers. It will help the non-pilots in your life understand why you love to fly. It'll teach them the basics of flying and show them ways to help in the cockpit. Now, by the way, my wife took this course over 20 years ago. I was amazed. She learned a tremendous amount in the course. I mean, she came home just literally talking, aviation. So it's a great course. I highly recommend it. Some of the topics include who are the people on the radio and how to talk to them, how to help in the cockpit, what to do in an emergency, how to navigate through the sky. So that cost is $99. That includes breakfast, lunch, all-day snacks, beverages, and all class materials. It's going to be held at Tradewinds Aviation at the Reed Hillview Airport in San Jose, California, Saturday, August 24th, 8:30 a.m. to 4 p.m. And we'll include links to the show notes. But essentially, to sign up, you go out to Santa Clara Valley 99s.org/companions. Now, a few weeks ago, I was down at the Hollister Airport in California, and many folks remember there was a restaurant there for many, many years called the Ding-a-Ling. It then closed. There was no restaurant for probably at least a couple years, and I was delighted to find out that there's now a restaurant at the airport again. It's called Seabrisas, Seabrisas. They reopened in February. Turns out that it used to be the brig when this airfield was used by the armed forces back in World War II. And so it's a concrete building. In fact, someone told me they think that the bathrooms were cells, and sure enough, I was in them, and it's all cinder blocks and probably about the size of a cell. Their specialty is fish tacos. I had the Cobb salad, but it was quite delicious, so I recommend Seabrisas at the Hollister Airport. By the way, if you want to find out where there are airports with restaurants near you, just go to eatattheairport.com. And if you find an airport there that you know has a restaurant that's not listed, go ahead and submit it so that website can be updated. And I want to give a shout out that dates back to our listener survey a few months ago. This came from Matthew in Pennsylvania. He says, I'm an AMP-IA and an AMT instructor at a Part 147 school in Pennsylvania. I often share episode clips with my students, but I would like to hear more maintenance-related content. He says his students are at Penn College, also known as Pennsylvania College of Technology in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. So a shout out to you, Matthew, and your students. And I'd encourage anyone who is either teaching classes or putting together a club meeting, feel free to go ahead and use any portion of our shows as part of your meeting or classroom and just let people know where they can find the podcast. And now let me thank some of our awesome supporters. Remember, this is a listener-supported show, and if you'd like to help out, there are lots of ways you can do it. Now, we have some mega supporters. These are people who donate $50 a month or more, and I mention their name on each of our news shows. Plus, I'll send them one of my books after 2 months. And our mega supporters are Tyson Weiss, co-founder of 4Flight, Victor Vogel, who lives in central Pennsylvania and flies the Cirrus, Tim Delaney, flying for nearly 50 years here in Northern California, flying an SR20, Stephen Elop, who flies both a Turbo 182 and also a Citation M2, and Larry Noe from New York, where he flies a Cirrus. And I want to thank all of them for their continuing support. Now, we also have some new super supporters, people who donate $20 or more every month. And this month, all three of them came from PayPal, which is a new way that you can donate to the show. They include Orhan Bazer. Now, Orhan comes from the West Valley Flying Club. Known him for years. He is a relatively new flight instructor, but a longtime pilot. Great guy. So if you're looking for a flight instructor, you might want to check him out. Aaron Benjamin, and also Ed Kelly, new super supporters. And some of our other supporters through PayPal this month include Grant Bledsoe, who's got a monthly donation, and also KMLL LLC, which is donating monthly. And we also had some one-time donations from Independent Beauty Consultant and Robert Dale. And we also have a number of new Patreon supporters who have joined us in the last month, and they include Bert Wattis, Eric Hignite, who edited his pledge up to $8 a month, Mike Zachary, David Catenia, Mark Katz, Eric Wolf, Bijou Kurian, Jeff Truelove, David S. Johnson, David Mackler, Shire Flyer, who I just got a message from, his name is Joel, and Jared Miller. I want to thank everybody supporting the show, and if you are interested, you can also get some goodies if you go ahead and support us through Patreon. For example, at the $4 a month level, supporters get copies of the scripts for these news shows like this one, and the $8 a month supporters get the scripts plus a list of links to all the stories that we didn't cover in the news because of time constraints. And this week we had about 16 stories that didn't make it into the news. So we've got a large number of super supporters who donate $20 a month, and all of them are listed in the show notes that we post on Patreon for each of our news shows. So if you'd like to help out and donate, just go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome to get to our Patreon site, or aviationnewstalk/PayPal if you'd like to make a one-time or monthly donation through PayPal. Now, in a moment, we're going to answer your listener questions about instrument flying and IFR, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Okay, let's talk about IFR. First, I pulled this story from the news so that we could talk about it here, since it's a change that's IFR related. Now, this comes from AOPA, and it says the FAA explains how and when to use clearance delivery phone service. When the FAA ended the practice of relaying IFR clearances between pilots and air traffic control through flight service at locations where direct radio contact between an aircraft and ATC is not possible, numerous pilots ask AOPA for more information about using the new direct phone numbers to ATC that pilots must now call. Rune Duke, AOPA's Senior Director of Airspace, Air Traffic and Security, has been working with the FAA to address pilot questions. He offers these pointers about which airports are affected and what to do under the clearance delivery modernization under which the changes are taking place. Pilots can start by becoming familiar with the communication facilities in use at the airports they use. The main change to note is that flight service outside of Alaska will no longer relay clearances to pilots from ATC. The flight service will continue to accept phoned IFR flight plan cancellations in places or at times when it's not possible to call ATC on the radio before takeoff or after landing. Information published by the FAA safety team telling pilots that phoned IFR flight plan cancellations would no longer be accepted by flight service was incorrect, an FAA official told AOPA. Instead of clearance relays through flight service, phone numbers are being added to airport listings in the chart supplement. Now, that's the new name for what I used to always call the Green Book, which was called the Airport Facilities Directory. So you now go to the chart supplement for the phone numbers for pilots to call to reach ATC to receive clearances. Now, in that book, you want to look for a line in the airport listing that says clearance delivery phone at those airports where the service is available. Duke explained that if no clearance delivery phone number is published for your airport, it is because the FAA is not currently publishing the number if the airport has a radio frequency located on the field for pilots to contact the tower, approach control, air route traffic control center, or flight service. However, AOPA has requested that the FAA agree to publish clearance delivery phone numbers for locations with RCOs, that's remote communication outlets, or GCOs, ground communication outlets, or airports without full-time tower operations to ensure that a backup communication method is listed. Now, what if an RCO or GCO goes out of service? Duke says that NOTAM to airmen about the outage will include a clearance delivery phone number to use until service is restored to the communication outlet. Beginning in October, the chart supplement will also include backup clearance delivery phone numbers for all airports with an RCO, GCO, or remote transmitter receiver to use if the radio communications become unavailable. Leidos, the FAA's flight service contractor, also can provide pilots with the name and phone number of the facility to contact. And Duke says, quote, so far the feedback has largely been positive about this change. Possibly the time and cost incurred by pilots because of delayed clearances is going down, and now that the middleman, flight service, is eliminated and pilots can talk directly with the controller. He said the changes to the clearance delivery system do not affect pilots operating in Alaska. So in my case, NorCal Approach covers an area that's probably close to 100 miles square on each side. So I'm usually flying somewhere in that area. And for years, I've had their phone number in my cell phone's contacts. And you may want to do the same by adding common FAA phone numbers for the approach facilities in your area. Just add that to your contacts. All right, let's go to our first question.
Hi, Max. Great show. Definitely one of my favorites. My name is Sebastian, and my question is about the instrument rating. I'm self-funding my IFR training and would like to minimize the cost. I read that I could use a simulator for up to 30 hours, which should reduce the price tag. Could you provide any ideas on the matter? As an aside, is there a way to combine IFR training with a Cirrus aircraft? I'm willing to travel if this is available. Thanks for putting on a great show.
Well, thanks, Sebastian. Let's start with the requirements for getting an instrument rating. In the FAR 61.65 says you need 40 hours of actual or simulated instrument time. And I find that unlike the private, which also required 40 hours, but typically takes quite a few more hours than that, 40 hours actually is a realistic number of hours for being proficient for your IFR check ride. But to get those 40 hours of actual or simulated instrument time, figure you're probably going to spend close to 50 hours of time on the Hobbs meter. Now, that's because the time spent taxiing around on the ground doesn't count, and also your takeoff and landing time doesn't count either. So to log 2 hours of instrument time, I typically see about 2.4 or 2.5 hours on the Hobbs meter when I'm giving a lesson. Now, most of the time you're going to be logging will be under the hood, which is a view-limiting device, but you can also log any time that you're in the clouds or in what's called actual. To reduce costs, you can get some of this time in a flight training device, which most people would call a simulator. And typically, you can do up to 20 hours of the required 40 in an FTD. Now, there is a provision that lets you do up to 30 of the required hours in a flight training device or a full flight simulator. Think kind of $1 million simulator on large stilts that moves around, but only if you do it through a Part 142 training center. Now, those places are typically where pilots would go for jet training. So I don't think you're going to save money by going to a Part 142 training center just so that you can get 30 hours in a simulator. So realistically, you'll want to plan on getting no more than 20 of your total 40 hours in a flight training device. So the cost you'll save will be the difference between paying for the simulator versus paying for the airplane for those 20 hours. But you won't save anything on instruction cost in the simulator, as you'll need a CFI present in order for you to log the time in the simulator as training toward your instrument rating. And I'm sure right now someone is saying, wait, but you don't need a CFI anymore when you're in a simulator. And the answer is, well, that's true if you already have your instrument rating, but not if you're working on a new instrument rating. So yes, as of 2018, an authorized instructor does not need to be present for a pilot to accomplish his or her instrument currency in a flight training device, but that just applies to maintaining your instrument currency after you get your instrument rating. Now, Sebastian, there is another way you can save a little money, but there are some downsides to doing it. Only 15 of the 40 hours require flight instruction, though if you do 20 hours on flight training device, obviously you're going to need a minimum of 20 hours of flight instruction. You could log the remaining 25 hours in an airplane with a safety pilot, and that would be, of course, a pilot who's got their private certificate, who's rated to fly the particular aircraft you're flying, and has a current medical. But before doing that, you'd want to get some instrument training first from a CFII so that you'd know what to practice. And one of the big downsides of doing lots of the 40 hours with a safety pilot is that you might be inadvertently reinforcing some bad habits. Now, if you had an authorized instructor on board, he or she would be helping you to refine your techniques in ways that you're just not going to learn by doing it on your own with a safety pilot. Now, you also ask about whether you could combine your instrument training with getting checked out in another aircraft type such as a Cirrus, and the answer is absolutely yes. When I was working on my instrument rating 30 years ago, I spent some of my instrument training time in a Cessna 172RG, which was a new aircraft to me at the time, and doing some of your instrument training in a new aircraft type can help you gain familiarity, and that'll reduce the time you need to get checked out in that aircraft. Of course, there are some things related to aircraft checkouts that you can't do under the hood, like the different kinds of landings you need to do, so there will still be some additional time required besides the time that you spent under the hood to finish a checkout in a new aircraft type. And sure, if you want to do an instrument rating in a Cirrus, come on out to the San Francisco Bay Area. I'd be happy to fly with you or with anyone else who wants to fly with me in a Cirrus. And here's a question that came in from Greg in Northern California. He wrote, I just listened to your podcast episode regarding using GPS on a VOR or ILS approach. I was also looking at the AIM, that's the Aeronautical Information Manual, section 1-2-3. It appears that for a localizer-based course, that raw localizer data applies to all segments of the instrument approach. So in addition to the final approach course, the localizer must be also used as primary navigation for any course reversal that uses the localizer for lateral guidance, plus any missed approach and holding pattern that uses the localizer for lateral guidance. If so, this messes up my technique of switching from localizer data to GPS data when starting the missed approach segment. It seems odd that we'd have to fly the missed approach holding pattern using localizer as opposed to GPS, but the AIM wording seems to imply this. Big picture for all segments, intermediate, initial, final missed, of a localizer-based approach, which would include ILSs, localizers, localizer back courses, and LDAs, that raw localizer data must be used for primary lateral navigation, while GPS may be used for primary distance, that is position navigation, and for situational awareness regarding lateral navigation. And for all segments, initial, intermediate, final, and missed of a VOR or NDB approach, either VOR, NDB, or GPS may be used for primary lateral and distance position navigation. However, GPS may only be used for primary navigation if the underlying nav aid is operational and monitored during the correct approach segment. Does this sound correct? And Greg, yes, that sounds correct to me. Now here's a related question that came in from Jim via Patreon. And Jim says, really enjoying the podcast, without a doubt, best aviation podcast on my subscribe list. Thanks very much, Jim. He says, a few questions. Using GPS on VOR approaches, what constitutes displaying the raw data to be in compliance with the regs? I've gotten several interpretations and wonder what you would consider legal and if that is different from what you'd consider prudent. Well, Jim, as you know, often what's legal isn't always safe in all situations, but in this case, I think what we're discussing is both legal and prudent, though, of course, my answers aren't official FAA answers, but let me give you my interpretation. Jim asks, is it enough to just have it tuned in as a backup? So if you mean by tuned in that you've just dialed the frequency into your VOR receiver, but the data isn't being displayed anywhere, either on an HSI or a CDI, I would say, no, that does not meet the requirement to display the raw data. He says, what about as a numerical bearing on the PFD, or some folks would call that a digital bearing pointer? And I would say in that case, yes, a digital bearing pointer is going to tell you everything you need to know about the signal. It's going to give you the radial that you're on. It's certainly going to point toward the station. So yeah, I would say that's certainly sufficient. He says, what about as a bearing pointer on a PFD? So that would be the actual pointer itself, not the digital numeric readout of the radial. And yes, of course, that would definitely meet the requirement. And he says, what about the main nav source on the PFD? And I would say, sure, that would definitely work for displaying the underlying VOR if you just put it on as the main nav source on the PFD. But then I've got to ask you, where would you display the GPS signal that you want to follow in lieu of the VOR? So when I fly these VOR approaches, I display GPS as the main nav source because that's typically what drives the autopilot. And then I'll just display the VOR as a bearing pointer. So no, I wouldn't display the VOR as the main nav source because otherwise I wouldn't be able to have my GPS there. By the way, one of the hidden benefits of displaying it as a bearing pointer is that you'll actually see that bearing pointer swing 180 degrees as you cross over the VOR, and that's just great for situational awareness. And here's a question that comes in from Esan in Southern California. He says, Max, I truly enjoy your informative educational podcast. I also have a question about becoming instrument rated. I'm a full-time software systems integration engineer. I've bought the books for IFR and had many doubts about the time and expense involved. I'd love to hear your professional opinion and guidance. And then he lists 4 concerns. Number 1, finding the time going through the course and later staying current. Well, of course, that's 2 questions. And Esan, I can't help you find the time to do the instrument rating, but I can tell you that if you can find a way to fly more frequently, it will reduce the total hours that it will take you to get the rating, which ultimately will save you some time and money. So don't do just 1 lesson a month, because that's going to frankly take forever to complete, but do try to shoot for maybe at least once a week and you'll see some real progress. Your second question is about finding the time to stay current. Well, you live in Southern California, you're not going to find it easy to stay current by logging approaches during the course of your normal flying, as most of the time it's going to be VFR, and to log an approach you'll have to be in the clouds or use a hood and have a safety pilot or a CFII sitting next to you. But you could also stay current by doing 6 approaches and a hold in a flight training device, which won't take more than a couple of hours, and as I mentioned before, you won't need a CFII present. His second concern is cost and finding the right flight school. Well, there are two main ways I see people getting their instrument rating. Either they fly with a local CFI once or twice a week, which is probably the way they got their private, or they can sign up for an accelerated 10 or 12-day program that will convert your time and your money into an instrument rating. Now, either of those approaches can work, but if you take one of the accelerated programs, here's what you need to know. Many pilots don't complete those programs in the allocated 10 or 12 days for a variety of reasons. So if you do an accelerated program, regardless of how many days they say it will take, build a few extra days into your schedule in case it takes a few days longer than advertised. Here's his next concern. He says, switch to the glass cockpit G1000 or stay on the old instruments to reduce the cost. I bought your G1000 book and thought about using Microsoft Flight Simulator and extra software package to fly and practice at home to become proficient, as well as reducing the cost. Well, Ehsan, people are always asking me whether they should get their instrument rating in a round gauge airplane or in a glass panel plane like a Garmin G1000. And there's no right answer to this question, but here are some considerations. You probably want to do your training in the type of airplane that you plan to do most of your flying in. So if you think you'll be running mostly older round gauge airplanes, then do the instrument rating in a round gauge airplane. Likewise, if you plan to do most of your flying in a glass panel aircraft like a Cirrus or any of the newer Cessnas, then get your instrument rating in that aircraft. Or if you want to move up to glass panels, doing that while getting your instrument rating is just a great way to go. Oh, and by the way, thanks for buying my Max Truscott's G1000 Glass Cockpit Handbook. Reading that before you fly is going to help you learn the system faster, and that will save you money because the Hobbs meter won't be running as long while you're trying to learn the G1000. And I'll just mention for anybody else who's interested in my G1000 book, you can go out to the phone number 800-247-6553 and order a copy. And his last concern, number 4, he says, currently I fly a Cessna 172R model with round gauge instruments using my iPad running ForeFlight, and I've thought about switching to the Sling, which is a South African aircraft with a G1000. And Ehsan, the Sling looks like a great airplane. I've read a lot about it, and they do have an IFR version of that aircraft. However, it's actually not a G1000, though it's pretty similar to it, and it's going to operate in similar ways. From what I've read, it has a pair of G3X touchscreen displays. It's got a Garmin GNS 650 Navcom, which actually is going to operate a little bit differently than the Garmin G1000. And it's got a Garmin GFC 500 autopilot. So hope that helps, and good luck with your instrument rating. And here's an email from Warren in Connecticut. He says, Max, long time no talk. I was listening to your podcast, which gave me a couple questions. I take it you don't trust the controllers will keep you at a safe altitude when giving vectors. Is that right? I honestly hadn't given that much thought, thinking if I were on vectors, I would always be theoretically, that's the appropriate word there, theoretically, given altitudes or maneuvered in such a way which would keep me at a safe, appropriate, legal altitude above terrain. Was that a big issue for you before GPS 2? How did you monitor it? So, Warren, first, there's a big difference where you and I fly. I live in California, where we have quite a few mountains that are over 14,000 feet tall. You're back in Connecticut. I used to live back east, and I know it's pretty flat there by comparison. So it's not that I don't trust controllers. It's that I know controllers occasionally make mistakes. And frankly, I'm unwilling to be that guy who's going to die because a controller happened to make a mistake. So yes, I'm ruthless about always verifying that I'm at a safe altitude when I'm being vectored. Now, this was a bigger issue for me prior to GPS because back 30 years ago, you could only tell your position by looking at 2 VOR needles, which was a lot of hard work to try and figure out exactly where you were, especially if you've been vectored off an airway. But I still think it's a wise practice even in these days of moving maps. And then he asked, did you actually have an incident where you were vectored dangerously low? And no, not me, but perhaps 20 years ago, we did have a Part 135 charter flight that crashed into a mountain at night north of San Jose while talking with NorCal and waiting for a vector. And years later, a friend of mine nearly died in similar circumstances in that very same location. And she told me afterwards that something I told her saved her life that night. I had told her that if she was ever unsure of her position, that she needed to be above 4,400 feet to be safe in the entire San Francisco Bay Area. Now, I would just find that as an area from Petaluma in the north down to Monterey in the south. If you get outside that area, you're going to have to be higher. She was in the right seat of a King Air that was coming back at about 1:30 in the morning, and they waited for a vector that never came. And she suddenly realized that there was a problem because of what I told her, and she had to tell the captain twice that he needed to call NorCal right now. And he didn't really understand why, because I'm sure they were both pretty fatigued at 1:30 in the morning. And when he did call, they were issued an emergency climb, which saved their life. So yes, this stuff really does happen. And here's an email from Ron in California. He says, "Hi, Max. Thanks for all the great stories. Great info, too, on go-arounds. Since I don't fly IFR much, I've forgotten the issue in procedures. This deals with lost comm procedures while IFR. Say we are coming back into Palo Alto in a /Alpha aircraft. Let's see, that would be an aircraft with Mode C transponder and DME, but no GPS. He says there's no way to fly to our clearance limit of Palo Alto before doing the approach. So is it correct to and expect to fly to an IAF and fly the approach?" And I would say, Ron, yes, that's exactly what ATC would expect you to do, because they want to get you out of the system as quickly as possible. So flying to an IAF is probably what they would expect, and that would get you on the ground faster than flying to Palo Alto and then flying back out to get to the beginning of the approach. He also says, what about if you had an IFR GPS? Would you do the same? I know it makes more sense to go to the IAP first, but I'm reconciling the regulations with real life. And yes, I would say in real life, same answer with an IFR GPS, go to the IAF and fly the approach. Then he says, finally, after loading the approach in a GPS, is it necessary to remove the airport in the flight plan as it appears just before the approach section? And this is a really big issue, which I talk about in my books and talk about in the presentations that I give. Yes, in GPSs such as the Garmin 430, 530, and the G1000, when you load a flight plan and load an approach, normally the airport identifier appears before the instrument approach. So if you just let the GPS cycle normally in auto-sequencing mode, which we're always using from one waypoint to the next, it would take you first to the airport, and then it would take you to the IAF to start the approach. So some people therefore delete the airport, but I think that's a bad idea. A better solution is just to take your cursor, jump it beyond the airport to either the IAF or the intermediate fix, depending upon whichever one you've been cleared to, and then go direct to that fix on the approach using direct enter. The reason you want to leave your destination airport in the flight plan is if ATC calls you and tells you that now you need to fly a different approach, which has happened to me, when you push the proc key to load that new approach, the GPS knows which airport you're going to, so it can offer you the approach choices for that airport. If you've deleted the airport, when you press the proc key, the GPS is essentially going to say, huh? Then you're going to have to re-enter your airport identifier so it knows which approaches to offer for you to select from. And now I'd like to get your feedback. It's the first time I've done an all-listener question show. Do you like that? Would you like to see more of these or something different? Always looking for your feedback on the show. Also, if you're interested in buying any model of Cirrus aircraft or jet or interested in flight training in one, please call me for a free consultation. In some cases, I can arrange a free demo flight for you. And if you're thinking, boy, I'd like to buy new, but I'm close, but I don't think I can quite afford it, give me a call. I may have some suggestions to help you there. I'm at 650-967-2500, or go to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the web page. Also, that's where you can click on Listener Questions, and you can actually record a question for me or leave any other feedback. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the world. And finally, please take a moment to show your aviation friends how they can get the Aviation News Talk podcast. And if they don't know what a podcast is, and literally half the people out there don't, just send them to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, where they can download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast app for iOS and Android. In the App Store, just search for Aviation News Talk. And of course, those apps are free. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.